We had a program last Thursday, which was October 15th. And our guest that day was Don Green from U.S. Trust. And we talked at great length about how donor-advised funds are used in wealth management, asset planning, and philanthropy. And today we are joined by Chuck Collins. We're going to take a different look at this animal called donor-advised funds. They've been around for a while, and perhaps they can be better used, at least for the public good. We're going to look at some of the unintended consequences of donor-advised funds, and we are also going to talk about possible reforms that at least should be considered, and I trust, in fact, will be considered by the next Congress, regardless of who is in charge there. I want to thank you ever so much for being with us, and thank you for your support of the Carter Center. Joining me on this call, other than Chuck Collins, is my colleague Mark Williams. He's a Senior Associate Director in the Office of Estate and Gift Planning. Mark is also an attorney in trusts and estates. And Natasha Roberts is our Assistant Director. With that, let me introduce Mark Williams.
I want to just say really quickly again, yes, there's a disclaimer there. Won't read it to you, but we want to make just an important note. Besides all of that disclaimer information, what we really wanted to do is to say that this is a pretty complicated topic. There may not be any single answer or solution for this kind of discussion. And so the real reason why we're doing this, the whole point is so that you'll have an idea about some of the different issues that are out there with respect to donor advised funds specifically, but also that you can be better informed and hopefully have an opportunity to have the impact that you desire with that information. So on that front, what we'd really like to do too, say another quick thanks to Don Green for being with us. He really did a great job of starting off that conversation. But without further ado, I would like to welcome and say happy birthday to our guest today, Mr. Chuck Collins. Sorry, Chuck, for outing you with the birthday there, but I couldn't help myself. Do hope it's been a wonderful day for you. And again, thank you so much for being with us. Wondering if you might be able to just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to be so involved in this topic around advised funds, philanthropy, and policy, and perhaps just sharing your opening thoughts with our viewers.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Barry and Mark and the Carter Center, and for your, the Philanthropy Council that is just having this conversation, to your credit. And I should start off by saying I'm not at all an expert in the way Don Green is in sort of as an advisor to people who have set up donor advised funds. I was really impressed, and it was great to be able to watch his presentation and your discussion with him. And I encourage others, if they missed that, to do that. I come at this from the perspective of somebody who actually has been a donor, but my primary concern is sort of how do we balance the interests of the donor with the interests of the independent sector, the nonprofit sector, the integrity of the tax system, and sort of the democracy generally. And I'm a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, and for the last 6 years, I've sort of been watching how has the growing imbalance of income and wealth affected society overall and affected the philanthropic sector. And let me just set the context, and which is to say, the framework that we're operating on, the rules and laws that govern charitable giving, were established in 1969 to set up, the rules governing private foundations and donor advised funds that we'll talk more about, and just individual giving. And one of the sort of foundations of that was this idea that when somebody gives money to a qualified charity, they get a tax reduction, they get a tax break, and in exchange for that tax break, they relinquish dominion and control over the money. That is the actual kind of legal framing. And what I would submit is that philanthropy, and more philanthropy among very high net worth individuals, does not look like it's relinquishing dominion and control. In fact, the money cannot be, brought back for individual purposes, but that philanthropic wealth becomes kind of an extension of individual influence, power, and sometimes in perpetuity. So I think the 1969 framework, in my view, needs to be revisited in the context of several trends. And I'll just mention briefly, and then I'd love to just sort of have a conversation with Barry and Mark. But I think that the big trend is what I would call, and the context is the growing top-heavy nature of philanthropy. So in 1969, there was a much larger percentage of charitable giving that came from low and middle-income households. But as inequality has grown over the last 4 decades, more and more giving is being done by high net worth individuals, and giving by low and middle income givers is going down. And we can look at this even more closely in conversation if that's useful. So you have this small donor decline, and you have this rising concentration of giving among fewer and fewer hands. And I think that poses some significant challenges to the independent sector, the nonprofit sector, and the like. Donor advised funds being a subset of that overall trend. What we've noticed is that low and middle income givers give a lot of money directly to charity. This is a chart actually that Mark put up that just shows this. We're a generous society. People are giving substantially, but we're seeing that sort of decline of small donor giving.
And Chuck, if I might add, I'm sorry to interrupt for a moment. I did want to just remind our audience, if you happen to tune in for this on Monday, this was a piece of data that was shared with us by Don Green at Bank of America. And the really important part of this is if you look at the right-hand side, the bar graphs, you're seeing a fairly sizable reduction. The largest bars that you see at the very top is giving from individuals. And back in 1979 through 83, it was about 83% of giving came from individuals. But by the time we're at 2018, that's declined to 70%. And so that seems to be a major issue. And as we started to discuss this, we never actually got to the point of what is this actually doing, this change in support from individuals? I wonder if we might continue exploring that phenomenon and why it's happening.
One thing, Mark, and again, just from a nonprofit point of view, and I think Barry has been in this business a long time, but I remember 30 years ago, people used to talk about the 80-20 rule. So if you were a nonprofit organization, you raised 80% of your money from 20% of your donors, which meant you still had a motivation to kind of pay attention to the small donors and sort of build a diversified funding base as an independent nonprofit organization. But what if now it's more like the 99 to 1 formula, meaning that 99% of your operating budget comes from 1% of your donors? All of a sudden, that sort of changes the fundraising logic within a lot of organizations. And it means organizations that are not sort of positioned to raise money from high net worth individuals suffer. So that's just one implication. The other thing I would just say is the wealthier, low and middle income donors, when there was, and there still is a significant amount of money that's given, mostly to religious congregations, but by people of all economic circumstances, low and middle income givers typically give money directly to the qualified charity. They give money directly to the food bank or directly to the Boys and Girls Club, the service organization. The wealthier the donor, and when I say the very wealthy, I mean in the top 1/10 of 1%, money goes to intermediaries. It goes to a private foundation controlled by the donor or a donor advised fund. And so the money, the journey to the qualified nonprofit active charity on the ground is sort of slowed down, if you will. And sometimes the funds can linger for substantial amounts of time. And so from the point of view of, again, charities on the ground, one of the the design flaws, if you will, of a donor advised fund is that a donor can give money to a donor advised fund, receive the tax benefit, but then the money can sit in the fund forever. There's no requirement that the funds then be dispersed to an active charity on the ground. So I would just argue that that is a design flaw. That doesn't mean that there aren't people giving generously and rapidly through their DAFs. There are people who do that. During the pandemic, there was even a movement called Half Your DAF, where people were stepping up and pledging half the funds in their donor advised fund. But from a rule-making policy point of view, there is this design flaw that the money the benefit to the donor is instantaneous, the benefit to society is delayed. And that's one of the things that we want to talk about. Is there a need to sort of fix that?
Chuck, may I ask you a question here? Has there ever been a suggestion made legislatively that money, when given to a donor advised fund, would not be immediately tax deductible? It would only be when that fund ultimately moves to a charitable organization, and then the donor would receive the deduction.
It has been proposed, it has been discussed, but it has not really taken any kind of legislative form. And actually, I think that's, Barry, what you're suggesting is actually one of the things that we've been involved in advocating for. During the pandemic, there was an effort to put forward what people called an emergency charity stimulus, which was a way to encourage more flow of funds. Because private foundations are required to give out 5% of their assets on an annual basis to qualified charities. And donor advised funds have no payout requirement, what they call a payout requirement. And a number of congressional leaders were pushing forward with the idea of, what if we did a 3-year emergency charity stimulus to double the amount of funds that foundations would pay out for 3 years and require that donor advised funds have a payout. And so that was an emergency proposal that is still currently being debated as part of the emergency response to the pandemic. One of its benefits is it's already been paid for. There would be no appropriation required. In a sense, the tax subsidy, the tax breaks have already been taken by the donors, so there's no additional cost to the taxpayer of putting that in place. But I think what you're saying, I think it raises the question of should we modify the rules governing DAFs to say the donor receives the benefit when the fund leaves the DAF, they receive the tax break when it goes to the active charity.
So that's a really great point, one that I'd actually like for us to talk about, because that seems to set the tone for some of the issues that are sort of a part of this conversation, specifically this going back to this idea of top-heavy philanthropy. Chuck, I wonder if you might sort of talk to us about how that incorporates.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the extraordinary imbalances of wealth and income of the last 4 decades has affected democracy. It's affected all kinds of things. We do every other year a report we call Gilded Giving, which looks at sort of these dynamics. I think there's a chart there that shows sort of both the small donor declines and then the fact that giving to foundations has continued to climb. One thing is that charitable giving has pretty much steadily gone up over the years, but most of that is giving by wealthy individuals, and it's masked that sort of multi-decade decline in small givers. These are great images of just sort of the increase in the amount of money going to private foundations and the increase of the amount of funds going to donor advised funds. And as Don Green, I think, talked quite well about, why is it that donor advised funds are so attractive? But part of that is the fastest growing sector of philanthropic giving, the donations to donor advised funds. And this chart ably shows that sort of small donor decline. And now with the the 2017 Tax Act and the rise of the personal exemption, we're now looking at a situation where it's really like only 1 in 10 households, 10% of the population, itemizes, takes the charitable deduction. So small and low income givers are giving to charity, but there's no sort of tax benefit for them. There's no tax incentive. So that's the overall context for kind of looking more closely at the role of donor advised funds in that story.
Fantastic. So, Chuck, I'm wondering, as we look at all these things, one of the other points that was made, I'll share just here in a moment, is this idea that these private foundations, these donor advised funds, are just accumulating significant amounts of resources and assets. I'm going to post something from the National Philanthropic Trusts report 2019, just showing the sheer number of dollars that are held in donor advised fund accounts, private or community foundations, and single issue charities. You're talking more than $100 billion in some of these. And so I'm wondering, again, as we look to the Gilded Giving report, and we're talking about this collection into these different types of vehicles for charitable giving, it seems that is also reflective of this trend that we're noting here in the Gilded Giving report and other places. Just again, the illustration of the declines by the small and the low and middle income folks. So can you talk to us a little bit more about why that's happening and just exactly what that is doing to the charitable sector as a whole?
Well, there is a risk that more and more money goes into intermediaries that is not, that the flow is slowed, if you will. The flow between the giver and the recipient is stalled out in these intermediaries. So private foundations, there's now $1.2 trillion in private foundations, and according to the excellent research of the Philanthropic Trust, there's about $120 billion in donor advised funds. But because that is the fastest growing part of charitable giving, and I should say part of why that is because of the commercial donor advised funds. So Fidelity, Charles Schwab, Goldman Sachs, the big commercial financial industries have created charitable gift funds and have marketed them to their clients. And again, just to qualify, this is not every DAF. There are DAFs that are revolving funds quite quickly, but the trend looks like one where the money is staying in these donor advised funds, and it's partly the incentive system. Once people give to a DAF because maybe they have a financial event, they sell a company or a company goes public and they put a bunch of stock into a donor advised fund, and then it's sort of they're saying, well, I don't want to give it all away in 1 year, so I haven't decided all the recipient groups, so I'm going to park this money in a donor advised fund, and that'll enable me to give that money out over a couple of years. But what's happening is people are starting to think of those as mini legacy foundations. Oh, let's pass the donor advised fund onto the children. Let's use the donor advised fund as a way to train young people in philanthropic values. Let's do impact investing with our donor advised fund. This is a growing area where people are using their donor advised fund to do interesting program investing. All of these activities are fine, except if you balance it with the needs and interests of the independent sector, which is to receive grants. It's all about it's essentially slowing that flow of funds to the recipient groups. And again, going back, I'll just say one brief. I was invited to speak at a conference, a kind of national social venture conference. Probably 500 very high net worth individuals getting together, talking about their giving and their work. And many of them, there was a whole workshop track on impact investing through your donor advised fund. And people were talking, and some of them were using 100% of the funds in their donor advised fund to do venture investing. And I had to say, what part of relinquishing dominion and control is going on here? Because it looked to me like it was a kind of investment club. It's a fine activity, but we're using a tax subsidized vehicle here. So what we're seeing is a huge delay in the outflow of funds.
And so, Chuck, I wonder, with that kind of delay and how this is affecting the system, is there any issue with respect to some of those who are at the higher ends of the income and the wealth spectrum and being able to commit to philanthropy and exercise it in a way that sort of meets these needs? We've talked some in the past. It's pretty well known. The Giving Pledge was supposed to encourage that kind of activity. How might something like that factor in?
Well, I'm very positive about the Giving Pledge because I think started by Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and sort of tried to inspire their peer billionaires to give substantial wealth away. And the basic Giving Pledge idea is you give away half of your wealth at your death, at least half. Many of these folks have pledged to give away all their wealth. And there are inspiring examples like Chuck Feeney, who started Atlantic Philanthropy, who just closed down his foundation a couple months ago after giving $8 billion, to charitable groups. The challenge for that group is that their wealth is surging so fast that it is exceeding their ability to give it away. So 10 years ago, half the group, we did a little analysis, half the Giving Pledge members, made a pledge to give away half their money. 10 years later, their wealth is double what it was 10 years ago. So what that probably means is people are going to end up giving to family foundations or donor advised funds or some combination of both. It will,
because those tend to be the more
that.
preferred vehicles, isn't that right? For those who are in the higher income and wealth spectrum?
Yeah, that is the trend. And when we looked at the Giving Pledge members, how many of them were giving directly to charity recipient groups? You see announcements about big donations to universities and other charities, but for the most part, they're giving to their own private foundations, which then invites the question, are these perpetual family-controlled private foundations? Is that the best is that the best use of the public treasury, if you will? And it's worth just saying, because you might be listening thinking, well, these are wealthy people, it's their money, they're giving it away, blessings upon them, and I think that's right. But we should remember that when people take that tax break, that's a substantial, subsidy that we, the taxpayers, are making. And for the most high net worth individuals, for the billionaire givers, for every dollar that they're giving to charity, they're reducing not just their income taxes and their capital gains taxes, they're reducing their inheritance and estate taxes. And it's a subsidy of about 74 cents on the dollar, meaning for every dollar given, about 74 cents of that is lost tax revenue. So that's why we're having this conversation. There is a public interest here in ensuring that this taxpayer subsidized giving sector serves that public interest. And if you think about, well, I'm going to give $100 billion to the Chuck Collins Foundation, and my unborn great grandchildren will still be deciding how it's given away. Is that the best use of the public treasury in that moment?
So that's actually a really interesting point, Chuck. And I wonder, sort of as we looked at those earlier graphs, we talked about how almost 25% of all giving was going into private foundations and into donor advised funds. And so I wonder if we might turn back for a moment to this idea with the the question about just what exactly is this kind of top-heavy philanthropy, this reliance, I guess, maybe it's starting to become on wealthy donors, doing to charities, to their missions. Could you talk with us a little bit more about that, please?
But Chuck, before you do, I want to emphasize what Mark just said, because if you weren't listening carefully, you might have missed it. He said 25% of all dollars, philanthropic dollars going into the not-for-profit sector are not going to charity. They are either going into a private foundation or a donor-advised fund. And so we see these billions, hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into the not-for-profit sector. Take 25% of that off the table because it never reached the charities. It just reached another arm. And if you really want to add insult to injury, and you have a private foundation, and you must give away 5% every year, 5%, an amount equal to 5% of your net assets, you can give that money to a donor advised fund that you control. It's okay. But the money has yet to touch the charitable sector at all, not a penny of it. And this is a real, I cannot emphasize it strongly enough. This is an area that too many in the not-for-profit sector seems odd at best and unfair at worst. And so, Chuck, as you start to talk about this, I just want to make sure people understand we're talking about a quarter of, 25 cents on every dollar is not ending up at charities. Is that correct?
Yeah. And if I might add to the question too, is that furthering?
Chuck, someday you'll get an answer.
So with that, and on that same vein, and returning to that question, then is that causing more dependence and reliance on these fewer and fewer wealthy people using those things? So it's a very, very big issue, and something we, of course, would love to get a little bit more educational info for the audience out there, because this is about them having the impact that they want.
Well, I just think it's, Barry, you underscored it exactly right. And here's the thing, that is the trend. That's that number, that 25% will keep increasing, I predict, because it's just a function of this growing concentration, this updraft of wealth. And I'm afraid coming out of the pandemic and the 2017 tax law, that we'll see even less and less capacity by low and middle income givers who are seeing their savings wiped out or seeing the home ownership rate go down. The things that make you feel like you have the slack to give generously. More and more people are going to feel precarious, and more wealth. I mean, just since the beginning of the pandemic, the 640 billionaires in the United States have seen their wealth go up over $900 billion. So we're just seeing this updraft of wealth. The good news is some of that will go to the charity sector. Some of it will go offshore or go to yachts or consumption. Some of that will go to the charity sector in the form of private foundations and donor advised funds, and some of that will flow to active charities. But the lion's share of that money will go into these large legacy foundations. So play this out 15, 20 years, we're going to have these giant private foundations created through billionaire legacies, controlled by family members. They're going to be private charities. They're not going to be public interest groups. And Mark's question, well, what does that mean for the nonprofit sector? First of all, it means that more and more of the nonprofit sector will have to reorient its mission and fundraising to attract the donations of the wealthy. So that may lead to some kind of mission drift, if you will, because wealthy donors have a different set of priorities and interests than the society as a whole. We know that from our research. So that's one really precarious thing. The other is more and more philanthropy becomes an extension of a tax avoidance strategy. Now, Don Green actually made a number of points about how people give generously regardless of taxes, and I believe that to be true. But there's now a growing segment of donations going into particularly donor advised funds because they are complex assets. They're not, I have $25,000 in my checking account and I'm going to donate it to my DAF. It's more like, I own this real estate, I own this stock, I own this condominium, and I'm going to put that into a DAF. It's a complex asset, and because for a number of reasons, donor advised funds are advantageous for receiving gifts of complex assets, more and more people are going to use their charity vehicles as part of their tax avoidance or tax reduction strategy. So to sum it up, I think these trends pose risks, perils to the nonprofit sector in its ability to be truly independent and walk on many legs in a kind of Jeffersonian way, to have a broad base of support. And the more you're I know this as when you have 5 donors that give you 80-90% of your budget, you pretty much, you pay attention to what those donors want. And if you're a university president, you are, thinking all the time, what do my 5 biggest donors want? How do I adapt to meet their giving priorities? And that's a risk to the independence of the nonprofit sector.
So, Chuck, I'm wondering, as we're talking about this then too, we've talked a little bit about the public good and concerns we might have. And so I'd like to look at for a moment maybe that question. Do we as a tax-paying public have any reason to be concerned about the system and the rules? Is there anything that we can do?
I think, Mark, that is the key question, and Barry sort of said it earlier. Has anyone proposed this? I think there is. This would be a good moment to identify the components of a charity reform agenda. How do we modernize the rules of charity to protect the independent sector from the influence of a small number of donors, if you will, to protect the integrity of the tax code, and to protect democracy in a bigger sense? Because I think the more private philanthropy kind of is a substitute for public expenditure, the less democratic it becomes. So I think there are things that we might look at. Private foundations. Should private foundations exist forever? Should the payout be 5%? Should what counts toward that payout include things like giving to a donor advised fund? As Barry said, you can count toward your foundation payout a donation to a donor advised fund. Well, again, that money hasn't gone to the act of charity. How much overhead can I count in that 5%? Can I count my program related investments and impact investing toward that 5%? So I think we need to make that payout, that 5%, real, not a fig leaf. So there's some reforms there. There's the rule changes around donor advised funds. Should donor advised funds have a payout? Donor advised funds in Canada have a payout requirement, but not in the United States. Should there be greater transparency so that we actually know something about where funds are going? Because more and more donor advised funds are being used as kind of dark money vehicles, if you will, for people giving to influence things. During the Senate hearings for the Supreme Court nominee, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse talked about the use of something called the Donors Trust, where wealthy donors give anonymously to Donors Trust to fund groups to prepare amicus briefs in support of a conservative jurisprudence agenda. Again, no accountability and anonymous. So that would be in the mix of reforms, I would argue, to kind of modernize philanthropy and protect its integrity, if you will.
So, Chuck, I'd like to also talk about this. That's a great way to sort of hit that topic of integrity, because it seems like this is sort of presenting challenges that could affect the overall integrity of the not-for-profit community, the not-for-profit sector, I suppose. And so I'm wondering again, as we talk with Donald Green about some of this, part of the argument or the question around that was, are advisors playing a role in this? And so I wonder, is there an encouragement of things like a preservation mindset or things like that, that maybe professional advisors can work to help their clients with, maybe to help move this along rather than from a legislative side?
Interesting question, Mark. And I think that there is what I would call a capital preservation bias in society as a whole, right? I mean, you want to see your wealth, you don't want to see it decline. You want to, personal wealth. People are focused on seeing it, the number go up, and yet when it comes to charity and philanthropy, we should be celebrating when the numbers are going down, when people take extraordinary acts of generosity. That's why I lift up an example like Chuck Feeney or Warren Buffett or some of the Giving Pledge members who have stepped up and are seeing the number go down. But many people who are in the advisor sector are they're wealth management, wealth advisors. Actually, Mark, you did this work. I think there's sort of a default to protect and grow an asset. And so that legacy model, and to pass it on, all right? So
yes.
if and I have an account at Fidelity, and I have a Fidelity charitable gift fund, and you get your statement, and it shows here's what you have in these different asset accounts, and here's your charitable gift fund account, and it's all added up. It's like it's all considered part of the same, your wealth portfolio. And I think that gets people focused on that sort of perpetuity legacy mindset. Whereas I think, from the taxpayer point of view, now putting on a different hat, from the point of view of, are we getting the best benefit for the, billions of dollars that we as taxpayers offer to subsidize charitable giving? Should we be subsidizing private, closely held family foundations and DAFs that hold money in a multi-generational way? I would argue that's an antiquated sort of structure that we should revisit. Congress should revisit whether that's an appropriate use of the Treasury.
So this takes us, Barry, please.
Mark, my righteous indignation is rising here. If I heard you correctly, Chuck, Fidelity, which has more money in donor advised funds than anyone else, if I remember my history lessons at all, sends out, I already know the answer, but I'm just trying to make sure that I really understand, sends out a statement that says you have Z number of dollars, X is invested in such and such, and Y is in your donor advised fund, and they combined equal Z. But the money given to your donor advised fund is no longer supposed to be yours. So how does that show up in a profit and loss sheet?
Well, that's where, to me, it's back to this whole original framework, which is I get a tax break when I give up dominion and control, and yet I'm being encouraged to continue to think about this as my money. So one of the great sort of fictions of the donor advised fund is that the donor is an advisor, as opposed is the donor is no longer the owner. Now, if I have funds in a donor advised fund, I cannot give it to my children. I cannot give it to individuals, but I still am the decider. It's still I still have control. It is a fiction that I've actually given up dominion and control when I decide where it goes in terms of charitable qualified recipient organizations. In fact, the first community foundation, or if Fidelity took my donor advised fund and gave it to another charity, that would be the first day that they're out of business, right? Because donors participate in the fiction that they're giving up dominion and control because they retain control over the ultimate destination of the funds. So that's where it becomes, it encourages that kind of permanent legacy. It's still my money. That's where the confusion that you're underscoring to me is. I'm still thinking of it as my money. In fact, I think I'll leave it for my children to let them give it away. And it kind of instills that, perpetuity legacy mentality that I don't think is really appropriate. Now, some people say, well, isn't it great we're creating perpetual foundations to solve problems, in the future? And I would argue, look, here we're in a pandemic. It's a once in a multi-generational experience. If you show up at a food bank and you're and they say, well, we're only going to give out 10% of the food now because we're going to save the rest for the next famine. Or we're going to come to your foundation and say, look, you should increase your payout to 10% because we're in a crisis. So, well, we want to preserve the foundation so that our great grandchildren can someday give the money away during the next disaster. That it doesn't square with how most people would think about the moment that we're in.
Good analogy.
Chuck, that actually, as you've circled back on one of these points, one of the things I did want to ask with this tax breaks in particular, you mentioned, I think it was 74 cents on every dollar basically subsidized for those at the highest ends of the income ladder. So it would seem to me then that, this point that we've been making or getting at here with donor advised funds is this idea, again, of society's interest in having those dollars be made available. And so with that kind of subsidization, I guess that's where I want to go back to this idea, just making note quickly of some of these stories that have come out recently, two here on screen for the viewers. Is this something that's more and more common where you're seeing people abusing that tax incentivized structure? The two here are pretty glaring examples, but do you think the proposals out there would address this also? Is it something that could be rectified?
Yeah, I mean, I think that requiring that donor advised funds have a payout, that there's a minimum payout, so that there's some guarantee that the money's flowing, that to me makes sense. Or that you don't receive the tax benefit until the money exits the DAF. Those could essentially fix the design flaw. And then there's the transparency question, which is, there's a whole kind of controversy about what is DAF payout, what is the current rate. You'll see different numbers and different ways of calculating it. But the point is, we don't know. The state of California, actually, nonprofit advocates in California have pushed for a DAF transparency bill in the current legislation, and I think it'll be back in the next term.
I mean, it went down in flames. So what do we? Any idea why?
I think part of it was it didn't get. There were a lot of good ideas that went down in flames just because of the kind of political moment we're in. But part of it is there is a countervailing interest group there. They're fairly powerful associations that represent the status quo, keeping the Council of Foundations does not want to see any challenge to payout, any increase in payout, any modernization of those rules, and the associations that lobby for DAFs no one wants to government to tell them what to do. That's kind of like, the default. So you have some powerful associations that are trying to stop those reforms. What's fascinating is most people, on the street have no idea what we're talking about here. What's the difference between a recipient charity and a private foundation and a public foundation and a donor advised fund? But when they learn about how they work, we did some national polling on this. People are overwhelmingly like, well, of course they should have a payout. And they're dubious about the idea that we should subsidize a private family to have a perpetual foundation that, exists for generations. So I think the public would be on the side of let's reform this and shut down some of the abuses. There's again, it sounds like I'm a little more negative. I think there's, some exemplary philanthropic work going on out there. There's selfless acts of generosity. There's all kinds of things to celebrate, but there's a growing on the margins, I would say, abuses. For instance, there's a large foundation, maybe has $5 billion in assets. They pay, it takes them $52 million a year to give away 110 million in giving, right? So they pay their chief financial officers $1.5 million each. They pay each of the family members on the board, $35,000 a year to show up for 4 meetings, so there's a fair amount of like self-interested spin off to having these large private foundations. There's things like that. Or as you pointed out, Barry, how come a foundation can give to a donor advised fund and count that toward their payout? Like there is unfortunately more and more examples of that. So there are just some fixes, if you will, that I think would restore some integrity to the sector.
So Chuck, for decades, you referred earlier to my time in this business, and for decades, I have said that a tax deduction is a benefit of philanthropy, not a reason for philanthropy. But what I'm hearing now is that it's flipped, at least in terms of perhaps some larger private foundations and some donor advised funds. It's all about the tax deduction. It really has nothing to do with philanthropy.
Well, I would not, I don't want to make judgments about other people's motivations, but I think what we're seeing is the fact that donor advised funds are so attractive is partly because you can give these appreciated assets, these complex appreciated assets, and I can give my condominium in Puerto Rico, and I get a valuation that it's worth $10 million, and I give that to the DAF, and I get a $10 million tax deduction, and then it sits in the DAF. Or maybe it doesn't sell for that $10 million. Maybe it's now only worth $3 million, but I've already walked away with my tax break. So there are, a segment of the advisor community who sits down with people and say, here's let's create this trust over here, this generation skipping trust, and let's do these things to avoid estate taxation, and let's put some of your money into these charitable vehicles, and you can give some of that away to organizations you care about, but you'll have perpetual control over those funds. So there's even something called, I grew up in a family where people were very involved working on conservation land trusts. They're now syndicating donations to conservation easements and selling them off as packages to investors. Like, how did this become a business? And I would wager that it's partly that there's this enormous wealth defense industry, if you will. It's, the tax advisors and lawyers and wealth managers, and these are good people doing their work, but their job is to help the wealthiest 1/10 of 1% maintain their wealth, grow it, and to the extent they're involved in their charity, continue to grow those assets. And so it's that asset preservation and growth perspective brought to the charity sector. So I'm wary of that, and I think the problem in our democracies, there's not a lot of countervailing perspective to that. The nonprofit recipient groups are not going to lead the charge. They're the ones who are receiving the money, and they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them, and they're not really going to become the constituency for reform. So then the question is, who is going to speak out to restore this balance, between the donor's interest and the community and the taxpayer and the nonprofit groups. And I would argue we need to build that constituency for a meaningful charity reform.
We have about 9 minutes before we have to wrap up. I just want to make sure, Chuck, that we get to the various talking points you wanted to cover before we have to say goodbye. And I don't know, Mark, have you received any questions? We really forgot to even tell people they could put questions in the chat box.
Yes, Q&A is open, folks, if there are things that you want to submit. I do have one additional question. Someone has actually written in, they've been listening to the conversation and listening around this idea that you mentioned, Chuck, with donor-advised funds being able to make impact investments and how that may be short-circuiting or circuit-breaking some of the types of charitable giving out there. Could you talk some more about that, please?
Sure. So, and I should say my concern here isn't with impact investing, because I think there's amazing work going on. You know, you can give money away, but you can also invest it in such a way that has a really positive social impact. It could be invested in affordable housing. It could be low interest loans to, you know, startup businesses. And so so my concern is using a donor advised fund as the vehicle for doing that. The purpose of the donor advised fund is you're giving to a public foundation, so you're getting the tax benefits of a public foundation, and the whole idea is that money is supposed to go toward a qualified charity. But what if the donor continues to use those funds to do impact investing? And there's one organization that does terrific work, but has $1.3 billion of investments that are tied up in impact investing. That you basically put the money in a DAF, so you are giving the money away, and then it goes into this impact investing sector. But those funds never make it to you know, the charity recipient organizations. They just continue to be invested. And some people treat their investment in Tesla as an impact investing. So it's just another form of, in my view, not relinquishing dominion and control over the money, but continuing to sort of treat it as if it's my money and I get to invest it how I want, and I get to experiment in making hopefully socially beneficial investments. So I would say keep doing that, you know, do impact investing, just don't use a tax subsidized, tax advantaged vehicle like a donor advised fund to do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think that was very helpful. One other thing, great question here, and this is sort of getting down to the brass tacks of it all, if you will. One of our viewers asks, so if I don't get a tax deduction until I pay out funds from a donor advised funds, why would I need to have a DAF in the first place?
Well, you might have a DAF as a place to organize your philanthropy and park it, you know, for a period of time, or you might. But I think that's a very interesting question. You know, the private foundation, at least you know that 5% of that money will be given away on an annual basis. You know, I would say that you can put money into a donor advised fund, and then you have this incentive. It becomes a giving account. You have an incentive to move it quickly, or maybe you get a partial tax break when the funds go in, and you get the rest, the value when the funds leave the DAF. Something that, if you will, addresses the design flaw that I get the benefit today, but the public benefit could be postponed indefinitely.
Chuck, it's
we have to sort of figure out how to balance that.
We're talking about a design flaw that you could drive a Mack truck through. As you said, you could have a $10 million asset. You put it in the DAF. You get a $10 million tax deduction, and then that asset bottoms out, and now it's worth nothing. You still got your $10 million tax deduction. Oh, well.
Yeah, and that's where the gaming of donation of complex assets is one of the areas for reform. You know, I've seen it, unfortunately, I've had a front row seat to it in a number of situations where, you know, I interviewed a director of a museum who says, well, we have donors that they go and they get an art appraiser and their tax attorney, and they sit down and they create the value of this piece of art. Maybe it's this mug that I made here in my ceramics class. I get an appraiser to come in and tell me that, it's worth, $1 million. I'm going to go give it to the museum here, and I'm going to take $1 million tax break. Oh, by the way, I'd like that mug to stay at my house too, but on the cabinet, but it's owned by the museum now. Or the piece of jewelry that I'm going to donate to the museum, I'm going to get a tax break. But oh, by the way, I'm going to wear it 3 times a year. Like, there are all kinds of unfortunate examples where people use and there's no, where's the public interest there? There's nobody sitting at the table saying, wait a second, what about the elementary school down the street that requires tax funds to survive? The community public interest is not in that design. So there's a lot of, like, I would call it kind of cozy relationships between wealth advisors and attorneys and people who are setting up these donations. And the donor advised funds, and there's a slide there, Mark, and I don't want to belabor it, but shows the sort of the difference between the two. It's from actually National Philanthropic Trust. It sort of looks like that. But when advisors are marketing DAFs, one of the things that they will tell you is valuation of gifts. Donor advised fund, you can get the fair market value, but if you gave it to a private foundation, you'd only get 20% of the adjusted gross income. Tax deduction for gifts of cash. So anyway, it's one of those things where it's the DAF is being marketed for donation of complex asset donations, jewelry, artwork, appreciated private ownership interests in companies. That's the biggest growth area in DAFs. And so again, to restore the integrity of the philanthropic sector, I think we should close down some of those, kind of those loopholes.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap
this up. If I may, I do have one other question. I think we've got time for this one. Chuck, really quickly, do you have any thoughts on donor advised funds at a not-for-profit community foundation type organization versus a for-profit organization?
Thanks for asking that. Yeah, I think historically, donor advised funds came out of community foundations, and the community foundations have historically done a really good job of kind of working with the donors to kind of move the money. But they're competing now with the big players. Now, the commercial DAFs have kind of come into the marketplace and have captured, the most of the growth in DAF donations. And the community foundations are trying to make I think that the case that they're a little more close to the ground and can work with their donors to move the money more effectively. So I think some of the concerns are mostly within the large commercial DAF space. But what I found is that the community foundations kind of circle the wagons when it comes to making these reforms. I think the community foundations would be well positioned to be the champions of restoring integrity to this and making a distinction between the community foundations and the commercial DAFs for the purposes of reform.
Chuck Collins, we've got to make that the last word. I want to say thank you very much for being with us today. You've been a wealth of information, and the fact that you would do this on your birthday is even more impressive. So we thank you for your time. Wish you a happy birthday for sure. I would like to thank each and every one of you watching in today. We appreciate your time. If you have questions, you will find near the very end of the PowerPoint that you should have received, 2 business cards, one for me, one for Mark. If you click on either one of those, they will take you directly to our email addresses. If you call the phone numbers there, even though no one at the Carter Center is actually working at the Carter Center, we are still working just from our own homes. And so those numbers will ring straight to our mobile phones, and we will absolutely be able to speak with you and answer any questions we can. One last time, I would like to thank Chuck Collins for sharing your expertise and your insight with us today. And thank you again to Mark and Natasha and especially to you folks watching in. God bless.
Thank you.